Hello and welcome to Sheffield Live. I'm Bailo Jallo and you are watching African Voices, a show where we discuss the achievements and also the issues that affect Africans in this country and abroad. And on today's show, we are going to be discussing about this book. And this book, it is called Journalist on Trial. And I believe many of you will know, as the world is going today, looking at the recent murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul or in Turkey, to the arrest of journalists in Africa or in many places in Africa and other parts of the world being locked up indefinitely without prosecution. So this book is talking about all that. And I would like to say it is a honor and a privilege for me to have here today the author of this book. And not only he is the author of this book, but he is also an editor of one of the biggest selling newspaper in Liberia. And this brother that I'm having here today, Mr. Rodney Sear, he is one of Africa's most talented journalists and also one of the most feared investigative journalists in the continent. So Mr. Rodney Sear, it is a pleasure having you in our studio today.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Right, as I stated, today this is our main topic. And this book has been launched just a month ago, or let me say a couple of weeks ago. So this book focuses on the daily basis of what journalists do and the trials and prosecutions that they face doing the job that they love. So Mr. Sear, if we may start with what is this book is all about?
Well, as you know, a lot of time people look at journalism as a profession that they fear. And during the last 2 decades of my work, I've been through a lot of tribulations. I've been in prison twice. The first time I was in prison was 2010 actually, when I was summoned by the Supreme Court in Liberia to explain why we published a commentary regarding a girl who was raped by one of her relatives. And the case became a big sensation and people were talking about it. And someone wrote a commentary questioning the objectivity of the Supreme Court justices. And I was called by the court to explain why we published this commentary. And in my attempt to explain, they tried to intimidate me and were badgering me with questions that, where I felt were, try to make me feel like I don't know what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. So I was held in contempt, and I told the Supreme Court justices that they were dictators, that they were not allowing me to talk about why I published this commentary. And I was sentenced to 30 days in prison. But it was on a Friday when I was sentenced. And on Monday, the former president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, was going to give a speech in which she was going to say that since she became president, no journalists have been arrested. So they had to get me out of prison before the speech. So there was a lot of back and forth issues going on. And in the end, they released me about Monday morning. By 4 o'clock in the morning, I was released from prison. And not long after that, we published investigative report about a minister who was involved in some scandal and corruption, and he was fired from his job. He was sentenced. He took us to court, and the jurors were tampered with, and I was sentenced to 5,000 years in prison. So the book kind of talked about all of these issues I went through in my life and how difficult it is for journalists in Africa to really cover these kind of issues without fear or favor.
So what would like to wonder, why now?
Well, I felt it was time because we live in a world where people are always hitting at journalists. President Trump in America, Donald Trump, was elected. Since he was elected, he's had this very antagonistic approach toward journalism. And I felt like someone like me from a continent where journalists are always being tampered with and always being intimidated and oppressed, I thought people in the world need to hear my story so that they can understand what we go through. As I speak to you, there are several African presidents who are using Trump as a means of suppressing the media. because Trump is always antagonistic against the media and calling them fake news. So they all in Africa now, they're saying, when you write about them, they say it's fake news, that you're enemies of the state, that you're against the government. So that's the new mantra now for African leaders, that Trump is saying, listen, if you write about me, it's fake. And so we as journalists have to understand that it's a process. So we have to, this book really details a lot of things that the world will come to understand about how we think, how we relate to issues, and why it's necessary for them to take us more seriously.
So in terms of this book, how long has this taken you? Because I understand there are several chapters in this book. Today is the first time seeing a hard copy of it,
Right.
but I've looked at it online when
Right.
you sent me an email.
Right.
So how many chapters are in this book, and how long did it take you to write this book?
I was in Canada for a fellowship 2 years ago, and because to write a book is not easy, and you have to really focus on what you're doing. I felt in Canada, Toronto, I was in a fellowship, a journalism fellowship. I had the atmosphere that I could think and reflect. So it gave me time to write this book. In Liberia, I'm very busy all the time. I'm up and down writing or editing or doing stuff. So I didn't really have time to write a book. So it gave me a chance in Canada to really put my thoughts together. And I think it was timely. It was timely because of Trump. I think Trump motivated me to write this book. I think the world needs to know what we're dealing with every day. And you can't just call someone's work that they take their time to investigate, to write and tell them it's fake news. I think that's the new wave of approach to make the media seem as the enemy. And I think more and more people overlook these kind of attacks. I think the more we see some things are not what it's supposed to be.
You mentioned earlier at the beginning that the so-called fake news now, as Mr. Trump always calls it, or the media biasness. Do you think, as you and I know many African leaders, the way things are in Africa, do you think this has given African leaders a kind of key or a platform in order to suppress journalists or to suppress journalism, which we know they used to do, but now that has given them the kind of like the right to say, look, if America can do it, or if President Trump can do it, I can do it as well.
Yeah, that's what it is. And I think it tells you that, we, especially in Africa, as media practitioners, we're not safe. Because before Trump, if you're in a country where you're being oppressed, like when I was in prison, I wrote a New York Times opinion piece that generated international attention. And Americans took notice, the British took notice. But now with Trump, if you're in that kind of trouble, who do you turn to? Do you go to America when Trump is behaving the way he's behaving? How can you address these issues when you have these serious things from a president of the United States talking that, that media is a fake news? So I think it affects all of us, not just me. I think that's why this book is important, because it's not just about one person, it's about everybody. And every journalist needs to understand that there's a lot of things that are happening in the world that affects them. You see what happened in Istanbul with Khashoggi and the issues that are affecting people. Last year, there were these 3 journalists from Russia that were killed in Central African Republic. I lived in the Gambia for a few years when Jammeh took over. In fact, I was the first to interview him when he took over. And the time I was there, journalists were being attacked. My friend Data Hidara, he was assassinated in front of his house on his way home when he got home from work. A lot of people were in hiding, were put in prison. They had to escape for their lives. So all these things are happening for the media, and it's very difficult when you have a Western nation who's supposed to be the world leader suggesting to people that it's all fake news.
Well, definitely. This book that we are talking about here, we know that this begins from the day your career started.
Right.
Back in the days, back in Liberia, when Liberia used to be, if I can put it that way, Liberia used to be Liberia, even though you will disagree with me, depending what time in the country you grew up, But I can understand from my parents, they used to say, like, back in the day, Sierra Leone was Sierra Leone then. So I will say Liberia was Liberia then, because during that time, you will not compare it to now. I know it was hard, but in my own situation, I would say probably it's more harder now compared to what it is back in the days. So let's talk about your career here, where it started really, because from the book, it says it started in Liberia, you know, where you got the inspiration from your uncle.
Right. My great-grand-uncle, Albert Port, he was a very, he was a firebrand journalist and advocate. And he had a lot of exchanges between he and President Tubman. He always questioned the methods Tubman used to rule. Tubman was someone who was very extravagant. He would take the government money and buy his personal boat, his personal yacht, you know. My uncle was offended by that. He said, why are you using government money to buy a yacht for your leisure when people are dying, people are sick, you know? So these things led him to become very vocal against what was happening today. So I saw him as a mentor, as a model, someone who I could look up to. And I think in my early upbringing, I grew up in a place called Snapper Hill, Broad Street. That's where all of the youngsters go and play, and the expats come into the restaurants that were next door where I live, where I grew up, Salvatore restaurant, and we play and we, you know, take care of the cars while they go to eat the restaurant, and they give us money for recess the next morning. So all these things were happening in a time when I saw the April 14, 1979 arrest riot. That was because the progressives at the time, they were very angry that the late President William R. Talbot had increased the price of rice, and they wanted the price of rice to come down. So there were a lot of riots in the street. I was a little boy then, but I saw my elders and my elder brothers and sisters, you know, and friends in the neighborhood. They were up in arms, you know, going to the street and looting stuff. So people were very, you know, animated. And then a year later, after the rice riots in 79, April 12, 1980, Samuel Canyon Doe and 17 men, enlisted men, they overthrew the Talbot government. And they said that they were going to eliminate rampant corruption in the country. There would be no nepotism. There would be no, you know, that the country was going down a downward trend, and they were going to fix it. Since that coup, nothing has changed. The same thing that we cry about those years is still happening. And Doe was in power for 9 years, 10 years maybe. And when the rebel invasion led by Charles Taylor came in, he was finally killed on September 9, 1990. And he was killed, but yet the war didn't stop. Although initially the rebels were saying the intent was to get rid of Charles Taylor, after get rid of Doe, after Doe's death, the war continued. There were different factions warring factions developing, emerging from this war, and they kept fighting among themselves, fighting each other until 2005, when the peace returned and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected the first female president. So I saw all these things, and I started the paper because I believe that after the war, there was a gap. A lot of people have been killed. People had lost their relatives, their friends, their families. So I thought that we needed a paper that would address these issues so that we don't return to that ugly chapter. So that's why the book kind of documents all of these issues from the past and kind of tell people that, look, we've been down this road so long. It's time for Liberia and Liberians to embrace change and, you know, end the chapters of corruption, and the chapters of nepotism, and the chapters of, you know, bad governance. And that's what I think we strive for. And I think that's why this book is tries to detail all of these issues, and it serves as a wake-up call for people that, you know, this has to end. Reflecting
on your career here from the past to from where it began back in the 70s or 80s to where it is today, because if you look at where you are now, you are one of the most respected journalists in the continent. You know, you've survived loads of, if I can say, assassination attempts, you know, or trying to intimidate you and that kind of thing. You've interviewed one of the most brutal dictators in Africa and that kind of thing. So do you think journalism has changed a lot? Because if you look at back in the days or 20, 30 years ago, there was nothing like social media. And as a journalist, you used to do that traditional method. You get your stories through your sources that are reliable, you know, and there was more risk if to say, let's say, if the story happens to be, it's not true, or how you can prove that it is true. But looking at these days, things have changed. Something will happen today. Everybody will know about. We've got WhatsApp news, as sometimes we call them, and all this kind of other social medias. So looking at 30 years ago and now where your career is, do you think there is still a long way to go for journalism in Africa or Liberia in general?
Things have changed. Like yesterday I was speaking, on Friday I spoke at the Chatham House, and I talked about the same kind of issue, what the changes that we're making. And one of the things I said was that nowadays things have changed because we have, like when I started Front Page Africa, it was an online newspaper only. And at that time there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was nothing, So we were relied upon to do investigation and follow up on stories. And with the emergence of Facebook and Twitter and all these things, people started with this whole flustering of news items from all over the place. Anybody can get behind a computer and just type in something and say, oh, this happened, and put it on Facebook or Twitter, and people believe it. Yeah. And that's really bad. It's affecting.
Sorry to interrupt you there, though. Do you think that there is a risk for the traditional method or for proper journalists, well-trained journalists, for that industry to die out?
It is. I think it's already dying. Like before I returned to Liberia, I worked for several American newspapers. And the last paper I worked for, they had 2 furloughs. That means you work a month, they pay you 3 weeks. And a lot of newspapers are folding. Most people go to online now for news. And although some newspapers have the print edition that now online, it's still affecting the way we work. Because the danger for just being online is the fact that Facebook can just spread false information. Traditionally, people rely on the newspaper to tell the real story. Now anybody can just do that. And when Trump goes around and says we fake news, it diminishes the work that we've been doing for all these years. So that's why it's important for journalists and the media to take this thing very seriously, because if you don't do it, it affects you greatly. And I think that's why it's important for us to do that.
So let's go back to the reason why you were sentenced to 5,000 years in prison, which I've never heard of it before. I believe you will be the only one that will be sentenced for 5,000 years. I don't know what the judge was thinking then, if you were going to even live up to the 1,000 years, So from my understanding, there was a story that you published about a minister. Can you just talk us through, or can you just share a brief of what was the story?
So what happened is that the international community, I think the EU and Americans, they gave some money. We had an epidemic in Liberia called army worms. It was affecting the crops and farmers in their produce. So this money was given for the government to deal with that. And at some point, the money was misused. Nobody could account for the money. So the government sanctioned an audit. And the audit found that the minister did not account for this money. So this is the audit report that we published. And we published a report, and then the minister was fired, and he took us to court. And in Africa, how the judiciary system works is very corrupt. So we were, first of all, during the trial, there were issues with the jury tampering, where one of the jurors said they were giving money to influence the case against us. And so when the judge came out with the ruling, we couldn't file an appeal to the Supreme Court because the fees to file to the Supreme Court is very high. And so we were given a sentence of, I think, $1.5 or $2 million as a fee. But we couldn't pay the money. So in Liberia, under the law in Liberia, if you cannot pay the money, you can pay in bits and pieces. To pay $1.5 million, you need to pay $25 a day or more. It would take you $25. It would take you 5,000 years to pay that money. That's why the whole. So
basically, you were not sentenced to 5,000 years.
So that's what it was. That's the sentence, because it would take you 5,000 years to pay that kind of money. So when I was in prison for because if I didn't pay the money, I would be in prison today. I didn't have the money to pay, so I would be in prison for that for as long as I can pay that money. That's what it was. So I think what this shows is that people in power were willing to use their power to silence me as long as they could. Because first of all, Liberia has a local currency. You could just say you find me maybe 100,000 Liberian dollars.
Yeah.
But you say US dollar that we don't use in the country. And we use it, but it's not, you know.
That's not the national currency.
That's the national currency. So they use those tactics to suppress you, to oppress you, to make you afraid of them. And you have to be strong. You have to, because I've been through this thing a long time, and I know these people. Like, I always believe that you have to be strong to fight back. If they see you as a weak person, they won't take you seriously. So we keep on investigating our stories, fact-checking, making sure that we do everything, we cross our T's and dot our I's, and make sure that we put out stories that people can relate to.
Well, as you've heard there, we'll just stop there for now. We'll be going for a short break, and don't go anywhere. We'll be back soon.